This is a distinctive and very old English sword. It and its type came about due to a quirk in English sword-making history. The one I'm holding in particular was clearly meant to be used. This was not a showpiece meant to just be worn on a belt or, admired visually or used to impress your rich friends. I'm not saying it's a poor man's sword either, it's not. Just that it was made with the full intention of seeing service, and it probably did, because we will note there are multiple notches on this blade. I count 3 very distinct ones that you just saw. I definitely want to mention this video is being made in thanks to Joseph Miller for helping me make the book Deadly Ingenuity. This is from the 1600s. Let's look at a very similar example, the exact same sword type. Overall, these are part of the sword group that we would call hangers, or hunting swords, or even hunting hangers, and they are part of the overall transition from earlier, larger medieval swords to smaller, more convenient for, let's say, early modern life type swords. And they're associated with the country, with kind of rural areas, but they were used everywhere, including at sea. If you're going to be serving on a ship, do you want a really long sword? Don't think so. You're going to be walking around in, and should it come to fighting, battling in pretty confined spaces. Our particular offshoot of this entire movement that we're talking about is, of course, the Hounslow Sword. Here's a very early example, and these are distinctive because of where they were made and by whom. First, let's take a good close-up look at the guard. Basket hilt type overall design, and clearly again, a serious piece of work. This is going to give you some real protection. You'll notice the guard is asymmetrical. I am not a European sword expert, although I'm learning all the time, and this does seem like a feature, a purposeful feature. I know it exists by design on other contemporary swords, colonial-era swords. Now let's get to where these were made. Well, it's in the name, Hounslow. I wouldn't know, but probably a part of the greater London area at this point, because it's 13.5 miles away from London's center. However, it was a very different story back in the 17th century. You can see Hounslow on the map over to the west, relative to London. So, back then it was a distinct enough place that gave these swords their own identity. But as I said earlier, it was who made them and not just where that made them distinctive. So notice our maker's mark here. That didn't mean made in England by an Englishman. Swords like this were being made at the time by a highly prized group of, we would say today, German sword makers. Sword making at the time in England was definitely not up to this standard. And as you can imagine, the typical way around that is to import your swords, or a lot of them. A more atypical way to approach that problem is to import your sword makers, your bladesmiths, and that is what happened here. Because craftsmen from the famed sword-making center of Solingen were brought in, Solingen being easily one of the most famous blade-making centers in the history of Europe. Actually, the world, for that matter. Let's do some stats on the exact specimen we're looking at today. 25.5-inch blade, 31.5 inches tip to tip. Single fullers on the blade. Look deep to me, but I don't know much about sword blade making. And you can see in this picture how the guard wraps back around the hand. It definitely provides some robust protection. Typical cylindrical carved wooden grip. Not too fancy, but not completely plain either. And you can see the knucklebow guard from the inside at the top of the picture. Here's our sword, the exact same one as imaged by Heritage Auctions. And you can see kind of the broad cutting blade, I think, best from this view. You've probably noticed the curled bit extending up above the guard, over on the left. That's a distinctive feature of these, but I don't think that means just the ones made in Hounslow, because you had these German, Prussian, Solingen smiths making swords in England. Well, they probably weren't going to invent a brand new sword type, right? They were going to make what they were used to, what they knew how to make. And of course it was somewhat similar to other swords of the day, because that was the fashion. That's where sword design was at. So for instance, here's a 1600s Spanish sword that certainly shares some similarities. But the question of the day, as you can imagine, is how did these sword makers end up in England? Here's a more refined piece of Solingen sword making, by the way. Well, what happened is that some of these Prussian sword makers from, yes, Solingen, were escaping the violence of the 30 Years' War. which has been called one of the longest and most destructive conflicts in European history. This was a nasty religious war between Catholics and Protestants in what today we would call Germany. So, our refugee swordmakers ended up running into Sir John Hayden, Lieutenant of the Ordnance for England. They met up in Holland, and he offers them a job, basically, to come back with him and make swords in his home country. Now, his king, Charles I, had received a Solingen-made sword from his dad, King James I. We're looking at Charles here, by the way. So that had happened before he was king, back when he was Prince of Wales. So he likely already had an appreciation for swords made from that Prussian city. So anyway, the swordsmiths took the offer, as well they might, given their situation, and this was kind of serious business because you were not allowed to share with outsiders the techniques that made their works very highly prized throughout Europe, and punishments could be serious, including death. But regardless, they moved, they got set up in Hounslow. Sometimes, maybe often, I really don't know, but at least sometimes, they worked on finishing rough blades that were imported from Germany. One quirk of all of this was that because they were outside of London, they could operate outside of the rules that governed native sword makers in the capital. One thing I want to clarify, it's not that we know for certain, or that I know for certain, this is the very first time outsiders, Germans specifically, made swords in England. We're looking at a couple of views of a naval Hounslow sword, by the way. But this was a very notable, maybe by far the most notable instance of that. And I say that because I do know these swords are highly prized to this day. Now, this doesn't always happen, and it took a bit of detective work, but I'm sure I found out the exact history of the sword I've been showing on the video. Well, I've shown various examples, but obviously I mean the one I got to hold. And it turns out it was one that was imported to America during the 17th century, of course, so that is well before the United States came over with some British colonists. Again, it looks like it saw service, and now we know where. And we also know it once belonged to the chief curator of the U.S. National Parks Service. Presumably a guy who knew his stuff when it comes to antiques. But yeah, it was funny. I came across this video in doing my research, and then upon inspection, I'm like, I think that's the exact one I held. And figuring that out took a lot of still-by-still comparisons and identification of, it was almost like fingerprint IDing, right? Like, okay, that exact pit mark, yeah, that looks like the exact same one on the same spot on the blade. And the notches like this one. Regardless, you now know as much as I do about this kind of sword, and about the exact one we examined it today, this one here. As noted, it pulls in a whole little quirky episode from 17th century English sword making. Once again, this video was made primarily as a thank you to Joseph Miller for backing the creation of my latest weapons book. Thanks, everyone.